Okay, so let's get started. So just to start off, I have a couple of announcements. Between the 23rd and the 30th, so Sunday to Sunday, it's going to be a potentially 50% off sale on Portrait Studio. For any people who want to gift it to someone for Christmas or own it for the New Year's, for their New Year's resolutions. It'll be the final sale that I provide between now and April, which is a ways away. So if you are interested in it, this will be the last sale of the season I offer. Like I always promise, there's always tons of sales towards the last quarter of the year because it's just, it's usually the holidays. People like to gift stuff. It's winter time, so people get into their homes and start drawing more. Summer's kind of crazy. Students don't really book in the summer. We just don't really have sales until I guess that's when Portrait Studio originally launched the first update was in the fall, so I guess it just stuck as well. So if you want to own it, it'll be at almost 50% off. Tell your friends if anyone wants to own it. It'll be the last time to get it on sale. I will this time also be providing, I know I always say it, but I will be providing the brushes on sale as well. I hope everything on the store can be at 50%, but we'll see. And today's lesson is going to be about figure drawing. But if you do have a suggestion for our next class's topic, you do write something on the discussion category in the Google Plus Hangout. In the Google Plus community wall. To get there, you just have to go to istebrak.com. And I'm just waiting on that. Okay. Just go to the community tab and click here to join the Google Plus community. Okay, and then all you have to do is just post to the discussions category. And Taurus already started us off for our next topic, so suggested topics for class. Feel free to comment here for anything else you'd like to see on Thursday. The catch is you have to do work for that day. You have to do the homework that you suggested if it ends up winning. So figure drawing 1, and then I made a post on our wall. Hey guys, the theme for Tuesday's Critique Hour is figure drawing. So if you want to see something for Thursday or even the last Tuesday, which will be the 18th, before the Christmas break, suggest some stuff that you guys want to see. It can be anything you want, as long as enough of you request it. Yeah, okay. What other announcements do I have? Yep, and we have Patreon. The new tier is starting on Patreon on the 1st. It'll be a private tutoring tier. It'll be only in groups of 4. So there's only 4 places. I might have 2 groups of 4 just working around the month, but it'll only be groups of 4 at a time. So if you are interested in the private tutoring tier, the new tier, higher than apprentice, it still hasn't been published. It'll be published for the 1st. You can join there. If you want to join as an apprentice, you'll still be able to have Discord access and all other assets given to you on that tier, including homework. So there's one really massive end of the year assignment we're doing right now, due at the 8th of January. And it's another book cover illustration that we'll be doing together, which is really, really fun. So if anyone wants to get into all of that, you can join me on Patreon. And that's it. Let's get started. All right, so I want to close as many of these as I can before they lag me. Okay. So, some of the biggest problems I see with figure drawing is proportion. And a lot of you are missing some components of the anatomy that you kind of make up as you go, or you remember it having been there and you kind of make it up. For instance, when it comes to the thickness of the neck here, the shape of the head, the placement of the collarbones, and then the little flab here, I don't know what to call it. I just call it flab when I look in the mirror. So what we want to do is iron out some of these issues. I'm going to start off with liquefy. The thickness of the neck for females should always be thin. How thin should it be? Just think upper arm width, or a little bit thinner than that. Oh, liquefy is a fucking joke. Alright, another thing is how bulbous you guys make shoulders, or how much you force shoulders into view. So this shoulder right here should really be back there. It shouldn't be that present. all that would be visible is just the shape of the shoulder. But again, the shape of the shoulder is more rectangular or squared than circular. I think you guys are drawing shoulders a little bit cartoony. They're a lot more geometric. There's a lot of bone in that area. They don't really bundle up into this bundle of fat. It's not like as circular as the breast. So if you've established that the breast is a low density object and you've used a sphere to represent that, and then you use another sphere for the shoulders, how overweight is this person that they have so much weight their shoulders are circular? So that's usually what we reserve for when we are drawing a super overweight character. We give them very circular shoulders, very thick neck, the neck almost disappears. And if you're offended by any of that, I'm sorry, but these are the facts. So the shoulders have a bit more of a rectangular jut on the outside, like a corner. So we build a corner. So she doesn't seem like she's over or underweight, so it's more of like a healthy amount. So enough with the circular shoulders. They don't really do that. Shoulders are very bony. The fat of the arms, the skin of the arms really hangs off of them, revealing a lot of the bone structure. They're connected to the collarbones, which are kind of the last little bone we see before you kind of gain weight or a lot of weight. The collarbones are very visible all the time. Again, with the circular shoulders, even if they have biceps, things are a lot more rectangular in that area. And if he is leaning his head down, his neckline shouldn't really extend that low. It's more of the shoulder blades that are super high at this point. This is okay because it seems like she's wearing some kind of pants or something. Your line efficiency is kind of low. You've cleaned up the lines, but the lines used to be hairy. You can tell because of this constant kind of jitter in the lines. So, as much as you hide them, you will still have the symptom of having made those lines, even if you clean them up. And the symptom is just this anxiety that happens in the middle of your process that throws off your line confidence. And line confidence is all about speed. So how do you boost your line confidence? With preparation, you make sure that you've drawn all of the gestures, all of the lines, the line of motion, the line of symmetry for the weight and the center of mass, and the gesture lines for the arms, legs, spine, etc. You're layering a lot of layers of preparation, a lot of blueprinting, so that you're minimizing your anxiety. Anxiety happens when you're just freaking out. You don't know what to draw. Draw it before you start drawing. Right? Decide essentially the most poetic way to say it is draw it before you start drawing kind of thing, but that makes no sense on text. So it just means, it's just my way of saying draw everything that you're about to draw without drawing it, which means just plan it. So before, after. More feminine physique, more realism in the downward droop of the breasts. I would add more. The rotation of the hip right here, you kind of over enlarged it. You didn't really lock the hip right in. Some of the missing anatomy, I would say, is the bone structure. Keep your lines fast. The placement of the belly button is great for establishing the direction. I need to shrink my brush. I'm not really sure what's happening. Of the torso. And then what I would do for female characters is just not, let me get rid of that, is just not draw the breasts until I'm 100% sure where the torso is. I need to just shrink my brush a little bit. Okay, this little line here is really important. I haven't kind of just stretched out my hand. It's important because it shows on the other side. So if we were to connect this torso here with the crotch area, we don't really see that there's a presence of another hip. Usually we have the stomach and then the hip right on top and like the thighs coming out of that. Okay, but we don't really have that. You have just one simple line. So that's the missing anatomy, I would say, is the placement of the hip, and it's just symmetrical across. And by symmetrical across, it's not a straight line. It rotates with the torso being cube and full of volume. So it rotates on an angle. Never rotate things at a vanishing point. So it wouldn't be like this for the body ever, because it's not foreshortening and the camera isn't right there beside her torso. That would only happen if the camera is super close, or there is a significant distance between the torso and the camera, and then there's something bridging that distance, like the arms. For the crotch area, I don't recommend just one little curve. I recommend something a little bit more geometric, because it'll help you dress the clothes with clothes later. It kind of, it's its own little surface down here. It's its own little surface area, the area of the crotch that points down. Well, this should be a little bit more compressed. So the line that we would use instead of that simple curve, which is very, again, very cartoony, very minimal in anatomy, I would use one that is a little bit more squared. I know it's a little bit awkward kind of just listing out how to fix these things, but this is exactly what you guys need to hear, especially when you're sketching. This is the things that are keeping your sketches down. Do you see how elementary it feels here? Just having that simple, almost looks like a guy's crotch, not a woman's crotch. To show that flatness and that lower surface area for the anatomical accuracy, you need to have that flat surface, and then it kind of just moves out. Okay, so again, it helps you dress characters later, especially if the character is wearing something skimpy, as usual. You're going to need to not represent it as a bulge. Okay, what else? So for the collarbones, you're kind of forcing the collarbones in. Sometimes it's not just a flat sticker. The collarbones aren't stickers that stick on to the body. What they do is either they're facing the camera and have that downward shadow and outline, or they don't. So what you want to do is just think about what would happen to the collarbones from the side if we were to see them. What would be visible? What would be the main core shadow? So there would be the bulge of the closer half of the collarbones with the neckline, and then a little bit of the line of the shoulder. You don't have to worry about the other one because there's just nothing there to place it in. You can try this. And by the way, the collarbone starts right at the shoulder. It doesn't start at the base of the neck. So you have the neck, and then you've got shoulder. Oh, it's a little compressed now. It starts at the top of the shoulder and moves down beneath the neck, and then you just connect. So you see the order in which I did things. I did the main landmark, which is the neck, another main landmark, which is the shoulder. The trapezius muscles, or this connecting fat and tissue here and muscle, is not a landmark. Why isn't it a landmark? Can anyone tell the difference between these identified as landmarks in the anatomy and the way you memorize? And the way I'm teaching you is good for memorization. What I'm reminding you here is the fact that you need to work in layers, and that's great for working without reference. To be too dependent on reference, it becomes too easy to just connect neck to shoulder and not ask any questions. But when you are connecting neck to the shoulder without referencing or analyzing your reference, you build a set of patterns and familiar things that you're supposed to do, and that's how you build a reference-free anatomy knowledge, by building these patterns, these familiar landmarks, and knowing what they do in different rotations. Drawing them separately, but at the same time when you blueprint later. So what is the characteristic here between these landmarks and this, and why isn't this a landmark? So other areas that are not a landmark, I would say, is the waistline. This would be a landmark. Because they are fixed points? Not really, they move. A lot of stuff, the knee is a landmark and it moves. So is the ankle. Something of the ankle. I would say the ankle and the feet are the same thing because they are an extremity. The elbow is a landmark. The rib cage is a landmark, and the hip is a landmark. What is the connecting factor between all of these? So, rib, not a landmark. Hip is a bone structural point. Landmarks are bone structures that are visible under the skin because everyone has a skeleton that looks the same. Good answer, and it's definitely a part of it, because its bone and muscle may differ from body to body depending on fitness status. That's an excellent addition to that answer, absolutely. But what is easier to do? So you have point, point, and then making a bridge in between. You're bridging anatomy in between. It's really easy to bridge anatomy between two elevations. So these all are considered elevations. They either stop and just elevate like a knee would, sudden stop combined with the bone. But the neck, I wouldn't say, is a landmark. The belly button is a landmark, but it has nothing to do with bone, because it's a, and in this case, the belly button is more like an additional little guy that reveals the direction of the light source, the direction of the rotation. But the connecting factor with these elevations is that they are really prone to rotation. That these all look very different rotated as well. So the neckline with the collarbones is never the same way twice, even though the neck is a cylindrical object. It's connected to the jawline in a very different way. Identify where let's say you have a couple of gestures. You have the sphere, you identified the jawline and the neck. That's a solid landmark that's going to help you find shoulders. You see how I'm getting so much of the gesture without any additional sketchy, let me sketch the neck with the shoulders, any additional anatomy in between these two. Find the hip, which is an absolutely essential landmark. The torso in this case isn't a landmark anymore, neither are the breasts. That's why we draw them after. And then we identify what the legs are doing with the knees. So this character's sneaking around. Okay, and then we find another landmark, which is the crotch area. So we would identify this as see how I'm adjusting as I go? I don't have to respect exactly where I placed the preliminaries, the sketches. They all just come out eventually. Sometimes I move it up, sometimes I move it down. Sometimes I'll just lengthen the knees. It'll become a very longer character, but let me just make them not sneaky. And then I would just place the crotch area just like that. So now I have a spine that is also working double as a spine and the general representation of what the spine is doing, which I have to recenter because they're not 3/4 view. And then a general, just an S shape for the spirit of the gesture. And then after this, you can start identifying where everything else is. You found some major landmarks. Everything else is really easy to find. So knee, arm, really stylized, sorry. And then now everything just falls into place. Got the rib cage starting from the shoulders. Got the connecting tissue here. Got the neckline. This is a very long character. Breasts aren't important. Then the waist. This is all secondary information that just follows the rotation. Part of the breast is facing that way. If I were to draw a general arrow, the whole torso area is facing in this direction. Find that general arrow of direction. It'll really help you align and twist things back together when you're creating the secondary landmarks. This is all secondary line work. Okay, so the unifying factor between all of these is that they represent a lot of rotation. The shoulders are so far apart, sometimes they'll just stack on top of each other. The neck is connected to the jaw, which doesn't look the same way twice between each rotation. So we've all done 3/4 view studies. The hips also stack and create like a constant rotation, stacking if the body is in 3/4 view. Whereas the waistline is pretty much always thin in any direction. It's not something you can use as a mode of identifying the perspective you're dealing with in the character. These are really, really important landmarks to keep in mind. When you're doing all this work and you're just taking care of it all early on, you don't have to address all of these major proportions later when you're creating clean lines. You're getting a lot of the dirt out of the way, a lot of the mess, a lot of the heavier kind of more experimental lines out of the way because you've decided on the proportions way early on. Good job on declaring that they're fixed points. They're not fixed because they move a lot, but they are fixed points in that they have to stay, they always stay rotated. You can't position yourself in such a way in the camera where you're forcing the camera to see both shoulders at the same time, even though you're side view. These are fixed in that the bone structure is immovable, but they also have a lot of rotation in them, and they also are connected to some crazy joints that do a lot of the work in your body. So the arm rotation, the potential for motion in the arm just from the first joint is massive. And then you have another joint that can move in another joint. And again, if you're not addressing the potential for motion, that's messed up. The potential for motion early on, you really will have stiff arms. You have to be able to see exactly what the arms can do in this angle. This is something I always recommend students to use, the little spring to point where the elbow is. Identifying where the elbow is pointing helps you know which side of the cube you're seeing. If you're seeing the front of the arm, if you're seeing the side of the arm more, and if you're seeing the back of the cube. So let's go backward a little bit. So again, if anyone can list what are the major landmarks to identify once you're done your gesture lines, or as you're doing your gesture lines, what are the best landmarks to identify in your work? So before, thicker neck, kind of unusual placement in the crotch area, a little bit almost masculine. Good, stacking with the legs for the moving character. The neck and the shoulder area feels very stiff. The rotation on the face is great on all of them because we can actually see where the chin is pointing. But in some of these areas, it feels like a lot of guesswork. And then there's the order that things happen in. So when you are thinking about the torso, just like the top of the torso, and let's just say we've added like the belly on top after that. Also has like a square base to it. I have no idea what I'm drawing. The torso is elevated higher. The chest bone is elevated higher than the shoulder. And the shoulder kind of just tucks in on the side. So that's why we can see those little armpit areas. For females, I would say it's a lot less intense, and then you have the breasts as a water balloon, as low density, so you have to show that sag. But when we have the torso as fatter and sticks out further than the shoulders, and then we have this drawing here where the shoulder line is in front of the torso, this is all inaccurate because the shoulder connects and locks in on the side like an action figure. So we would still see that outer motion of the volume of the chest in front, in fact, even more than that, in front. So this C shape is perspective, all right? It helps reveal your perspective. If you are drawing shoulders from the side, then you have shoulder, breast, or chest, and then you can have another shoulder, but it really doesn't make much sense to throw in the shoulder unless you've rotated enough. You can throw in another shoulder if you want to, if you're doing from the side. Throw in another shoulder line like that as well as this one if the arms are rotated forward, but it doesn't make much sense to use this when you don't have an elevation or any kind of stacking. But we do see this stacking a lot in the hip area, so line, stack, stack, and then line. So one object in front of the other. This C shape, because we're missing all of our cubes, we no longer have, cube in front of cube. I have no idea what I'm drawing right here. In front of another cube. There we go, much better. My brain is not functional. We can't depend on this cube to be located in a reference. We don't have any more geometric polygons visible in a reference. All we have are the C shapes because everything is now organic and everyone's a sack of flesh and meat and squishy stuff. So this C shape is really, really important to locate because it helps establish rotation. So here would have been great. Here would have been great. The belly button is a kind of C shape. It helps reveal that middle line. Forget what it's called. Here is also a C shape in the breast area. It just depends what the clothes are doing. Then you have that C shape of the other shoulder, which should disappear. and towards the bottom, towards the breast. All right. So remember that C shape for noses, chins, lips, and then the eyes. Exactly the same. Cheekbones, forehead. You need to just locate that. And it all goes back to the shapes that you're dressing your gesture lines with. All the shapes that you're dressing should be a mix between cylinders and cubes. Usually I use a cylinder for the hips because they're almost always pointing in the same direction. The bones that move are the bones like joints, that they can move or connected to joints, but bones don't bend. The bones don't, I mean, some people do have bendy bones, but those are rare. But bones are pretty static. The only way they move is because of the joint. Once you remember that there's a lot of areas that just simply do not move. They are not a joint in and of themselves. There's a joint attached to the hip, but the hip bone and the pelvic bone are pretty still. So if you can identify where you want the bone to be, one connecting shape between the two should be enough. It also is wonderful for reminding you, this should be more compressed, the perspective. So that has a symmetry line going through it, and then there's the belly button. Always really easy to find. But if the hips are facing this way, and this does happen, the spine is very flexible, and the torso is kind of facing forward, so the person's kind of rotated forward a little bit. Like breasts are facing forward, hip is to the side. Don't know how that would happen, but it happens. Then you would just find an average for the belly button. And the belly button is usually like this, the end point, the triangular kind of end point towards the torso. Towards the waist, at the base of the torso. I usually consider the torso only up until the belly button. After that is all hips. I think hips for females start right over here because it's a very gender, high gender characteristic, as well as just the entire clothing, how clothing is usually seamed and all of that. I usually just consider the belly button up to be torso, not the whole thing. That way I can remind myself that they are completely different entities and that there's a bunch of jiggly stuff and intestines between the ribs and the rest of the bone on the lower half of the body. And it's not a landmark. It's really easy. For female gender, yes, the thin waist is a landmark. Anatomically and structurally, this looks like a death mask. It's really useless. It doesn't show you perspective very easily apart from the belly button, which is a minor landmark at the end of the day. But it's great for establishing perspective. Really good for that. But obviously the shoulders need to be identified first, the hips. And usually where the knees look is decided by where the hips look. You're not going to have knees that face this way while the hip faces this way. It's just not going to happen. Try to do it yourself. Try to face your knees exactly perpendicular to where your hips are facing. You have to have some crazy flexibility or to be double jointed to be able to spread your leg that far. Unless you're, never mind. Insert girl you want to talk shit about here. So the belly button always decided usually with where the hips are facing because they're fixed. But the high flexibility here can allow the knee to look in a different area, but never directly on the side of the body where the waist or the oblique area faces. Remember, everything has an arrow to it. If you remember back to your form studies, always think like surface areas come attached with arrows. That's why we even look for the cube, because it helps us find where the shadows are. Every shape you use to dress up your gesture lines, always imagine those shapes come with arrows attached to them that reveal to you where these surface areas are looking so that you know where to place the light. So yep, everything is a cube. And then we have, don't stack if there's no elevation, because how are you supposed to stack? Things are too flat, they're not stacking. Give them volume, they start to overlap each other. So the knee, knowing that it's going to not really be that fixed to place, you have to find, if you were to do this all in order, I would say spine, hip bones, torso. Remember that everything is considering the rotation involved. So if it's 3/4 view, show a little bit more, even draw the symmetry line, more of one side than the other. The torso shape I would bring in last. I'd find the triangle of the placement of the shoulders. Neck is super easy to find. Usually you guys do the neck first. Stop working top down, start working spine out, okay? It's not top down, it's spine out. All right? Does anyone have any other thoughts on why we're working spine out? What is so important about the spine that we're drawing at first? All right, and then we find shoulders, shoulder joints, the sphere. I mean, you can use the sphere, but when you add bone back in, just like we do with a knee, we're doing this. We're adding a little placement for the knee. When we draw the thigh bones back in, the thigh fat back in, and then the knee bones, we are adding that extra level of fat to the outside, but we're stripping all the fat away from the knee bone and showing how it juts out really geometrically. And to zoom in even more, really geometric, kind of like the knobby bits. That's kind of what I do with knees. Maybe not that badly, just like that, if we were to really zoom into a thigh. It's not top down, it's spine out. So finding the spine is connected to which major initial motion that you're doing with your gesture. I just gave it away. It's your gestures. So when you're doing your gesture lines and you're working spine out, you've addressed the fact that the spine is part of the motion of the body. So the spine in this case is what would have helped you make an even more appealing shape for this entire gesture. She seems to be floating or jumping. Usually when we're jumping any kind of jump, our spine does this crazy outward shape. And we have more of an appeal. Also, it helps with pinup drawings if you do that. So yeah, your neck was way too thick. Really thin that out. Relax the shoulders a little bit. They're way too intense. Even though the shoulders are tensed considering the athleticism behind this motion, it was still too tense in your version. But remember, you do need a little bit of tension. Don't overdo the armpit connecting line for the arm to the torso. Okay, so this spine shape right here, spinal, is something that you would have drawn first. All right, and you're working spine out, meaning spine, triangle of the shoulders. Remember that it also considers your quarter view, so you see how this triangle is bigger than this one. Placement of the shoulder line, and then the fixed cylinder in between. Shoulder sphere, and then the same thing with the hip bones. Where's the hip bone facing? Sphere, sphere, cylinder, cylinder. Now you know where the belly button is facing. And then the spine, and this is the key here, it's never spine and then neck. All right, that's not how it works. The spine is the neck. Write that down. So whatever the neck is doing, it's the spine. Whatever the spine is doing, that's what the neck will do. The neck is considered, I would consider it a tail of the spine, just an upward tail. It's just a connecting thing. Wherever the spine finished off is where the neck is going to start off. So the character doing this with their body seems okay now that we've placed the neck where it belongs. Usually you guys are so used to that popsicle style placement of the neck and the head, you forget that the neck from the side does not look like that. So if the face was from the side and you've got the jawline, the neck doesn't do this. And then you've got the spine. A lot of you do this. The neck does more of a healthy spherical shape. Even if the person has perfect posture. And by perfect posture, I would just be forced to stick your chest out on purpose. It wouldn't be natural, perfect posture. With the shoulders low and the butt out is what we would call perfect posture. So this is all one gesture. The spine out includes the neck. You're not leaving the head last. And then right where the neck ends is where the sphere of the cranium is. And then the jaw is right under that. The jaw isn't going to just sit. Remember, you're giving length here. This is where the shoulders would start. So you're already giving some length to the jawline before you get to the jawline. You see, this is all anatomically accurate. You're working with landmarks, but you're still following natural patterns in the way bone and muscle wrap around each other. The spine is the neck. Okay? What other little additions does anyone have any questions about all of this hullabaloo? So the neck is limited by the spine shape. Yes, the neck isn't going to do things the spine can't do. That's how people get herniations in their neck and all that cervical area. They try to do things their spine is not accustomed to. And that's usually why we lose a lot of our function when any kind of, thing happens to our neck. It's just impossible to move. Why should it be so impossible to move our shoulders when we have a neck injury? So I remember having neck injuries and my whole arm would be difficult to move because it's all just one motion. It's all just one unit. You don't just hurt the neck and then everything else is still functional. You can't. When you hurt the neck, even just twisting your body a little bit or moving in a different direction, it's all just one collapsed set of just vertebrae, one on top of the, not collapsed, but stacked. And when you move and collapse them in a certain way, you're stretching the muscles attached to them. It's connected to everything. And that's why we spine out. That's why we're doing spine out. It connects us to everything. And as soon as you find the hips, you just have to measure 4 heads down. Sometimes it's 5 heads, sometimes it's 4.5, depending. But usually whatever you decide up here, and you can just finish all that you need to render up here. You just get that entire length, and that would be the length of the rest of the body. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter, sometimes it's a little bit longer. So from the side, then also another S shape that you have, a very stretched S. Don't go crazy though, it's not an ostrich leg, but it's still pretty curved, is the placement of the knee and the thigh from the hip bone. So we have the sphere, or cylinder, or cube, and however you look at it. Remember, you use different shapes for different perspectives. Sometimes you're seeing the thigh as a jelly donut, or whatever the heck these little swirls are. And sometimes the thigh gets to be really geometric, especially in men if you're seeing it from like the side view, where you see the pelvic area or the groin area, and then you're seeing the knee. You see a lot of geometry in this area, especially when light hits only the top and doesn't continue all the way down. It's not a perfect cylinder all the time. But from side view, always sticks out a little bit further than the hip bones, unless it's super skinny. And then the placement of the feet, and then the fat of the calves, and then the harsh, straight bone of the shin bones. And we don't mess with that. We don't give the shin bones a curve. They're always straight. And the curve starts towards the top. And the curve really is just reminding you that there's fat on the other side and fat on the inside. And then no fat here, no fat here. Sphere for the heel, sphere for the little, the ball of the foot, I think. Another sphere for the arch, a curve for the arch. And then another sphere for the big toe or the little toe, or however you're going to place them. Usually it's not this exaggerated, usually it's flatter. But just to remind you. And then this area here, not a landmark really, not a high perspective, except for the fact that you can see the back of the knee, but I would just connect that right in. Worry more about that outward little geometric tuck of the knee. That's how I keep my drawings anatomically correct. I try, or as close as possible, I try to build these landmarks and become very familiar with them. In that I know what they do in different rotations, and as long as I've memorized what shoulders do, what the neck width would do, the hips, and what I'm just imagining. I'm not imagining the body, I'm just imagining shapes. As long as I know what these shapes are doing in rotation, and that's all it really means, knowing where to put the symmetry line in 3/4 view, I can do everything else. And my springs for the elbows and the knees, as well as the layering of different motions and gesture lines, I've prepared the entire figure with more than just planning lines. They're actual lines that are anticipating anatomy, reminding me where to throw in masses of fat versus minimizing fat and keeping things bony. Work from spine to what? What's the next step? So spine out, you can literally start anywhere. It just depends on what the gesture is doing. You guys are very obsessed with starting with the head, and so the head is the first thing you jump to. But for me, the first thing after the spine is I'll just find the shoulders. And then the head, if it does its own thing, if it's tilted or whatever, I'll be able to throw that in whenever I want to. And then I'll be able to throw in the shape of the head. So we have head, chin, cranium, chin, jaw, neck, and then the crosshairs for the eyes. And then we have the 3/4 view, which is the part of the head that goes inward into the cube. So I would be able to do that after, and I wouldn't be in any danger of doing it disproportionately, because I'm not measuring with the head just yet. I can do whatever I want with the body. I can readjust the size of the head if I need to. Everything is really rough. The spine, shoulders, hips, and then head, and then knees, with that, whatever it is that your character's going to be doing. By this time, I hope you have the general gesture for what the body is doing. So you've got the general gesture, the spinal gesture, and then the line of symmetry that makes sure your character isn't going to fall down. These 3 lines, really. So general gesture is like the spirit of the gesture. The spine is whatever the character is going to be doing. Usually it moves along the bigger gesture of the body. And then you just start throwing in whatever other details you have for the character. Okay? It's hard to do this without working on top of a reference, but let me see if I can find one. Where do you position the calves? Right above, just under the knee on the other side. So again, like I drew from earlier, the S shape of the legs from the side. The fat has already been added for the knee. You've got the knee shape with the square. It just sits on the other side, generally more on the other side of the shin bone line, which is the end of the line you used for that spring that you should have drawn. And then you've got the ankle bone. So a big sphere. Bodies of fat get spheres. So the thigh gets a sphere sometimes. Breasts get a sphere. The belly button gets a sphere. Or the belly area gets a sphere. The shoulders can get a sphere if they are positioned in a way where you see more of the sphere, like the side view. But front view, the shoulder should have more of a square. That's why I use the triangle here to remind me there's a point. The upper arms and forearms, if they're not skinny, if they're not super skinny, get a sphere. These get a sphere, and the heels get a sphere. Everything else gets a cube. Sometimes I layer the cubes and spheres just because it's stupid to just draw a cube only on the wrist, or the cube only on the ankle bone. I'll just throw a big cube here and just throw the sphere on top to remind me. A square or cube, depending on the perspective. For the knees, I use a sphere because I cheat. I know that I'm supposed to be using a square, but for you guys, you really need something to indicate that this is an elevation, and that's why it's a landmark. Landmarks are elevations. Also bones, also fixed, also can be joints. Yep, the butt can be a sphere. So is it correct to start with rib cage, then spine? No, no, because what's the rib cage going to be placed on? Even if you try as hard as you want to, you're still going to place it wrong if you don't know how much of the rib cage you're seeing. Unless you're doing work in your mind you're not showing, which is why in school they say show your work, because we just want to see that you're doing it right. So if you're drawing the rib cage and you're drawing this, and then you're throwing the spine out, well, we should have, if this really was the spine you started off with, this would have, if you had drawn it first, would have inspired you to show more of the lower part. Oopsie. The lower part of the rib cage, because we would have seen more, which means we'd have seen the belly button from a worm's eye view, which means we have the hip bones are actually facing down, and the legs are, so the camera is beneath, almost beneath the character, and the head is stacked behind the torso, and the arms are behind. Okay, so then you'll have a leg, if it's higher, facing away from the camera in front of the hip bone, hiding some of the stomach. So if the character is drawn without perspective, then, and you have a reference or working without reference, try as hard as you might. God bless you, you might think you're doing perspective, but you're not. The spine was not prepared for that. Sometimes the spine curves from the side view. You draw the torso first, and it's supposed to be side view. You'll draw it too straight. Side view, if this is really what's happening and it's like some sort of ballet movement and the character's arms are thrown behind them, the torso is experiencing a really, really high arrow. So this is the side of the torso, or we can just do it like that. The arrow on the surface area of the torso is facing way high, and then you've got the butt way behind. Or if it's a lunge. Okay, and then the neck is easy to find, and then you know what the jawline is doing. You have to start with the spine first. It's always spine out, because that's what captures the nature of the motion. And if all your characters are just standing still with the really basic spine, it's not really doing much. I mean, this one we corrected, but it was pretty straight. That's when you're gonna have a boring variety of work. In the spine, you can show pride. You can show depression. You can show sneak. Look at that sneaky motherfucker. You can show flirtation. Well, the shoulders really are where you can show flirtation. There's so much expression in the body when it comes to the spine. If you're not using it, then you're not drawing very intriguing characters, or really telling a story. And if this is all going to be for an illustration, it's a one shot, it's just an illustration, and the character's doing some crazy motion. Let's say it's worm's eye, the character's jumping. Bird's eye, the character's jumping. They're not really doing anything static. They're just really, really jumping from area to area. If it's that pole vaulting challenge that we use, the spine is such a pivotal part in showing an open, explosive gesture that it's impossible to draw the character without first having drawn the spine. It is impossible to draw the character without the first brushstroke being the spine. Okay? What other expression can you show with the spine? You can show sleep. All right? Even the fetal position it's all about the rotation of the spine forward and the tucking of the legs. One big C shape or sphere. Open, close. I usually leave one of those. All right? A perfectly straight character design is not a character design that has a gesture. It's not even a standing gesture. It's just a T pose. It's nothing. It's nothing. The character is not a person yet. They're only a person once you've applied the gesture. Even a little bit of motion. See that? Even this added pride to the character. This is how you just keep it perfectly still for a gesture line. Remember, from the hips down to the ankles, the femur goes inward. Forcing the rest of the body inward. The hips are thicker or wider than the ankles are to each other when they're standing perfectly. And when you're doing shoulder width apart in the gym or when you're working out is when you're forcing your legs to be apart. And this is more for males or for demanding, commanding characters. Just think archetypes. Male character is legs apart, or any other character of power. And then delicate characters, effeminate characters, even if it's a male who is more academic, legs are closer together. Spread the legs, you add power to the character. But that's all lower body. There's really not much else you can do with the lower body. You're either bending the legs, they're straight, or they're apart. There's really no other combination. And yes, there's a lot of expression to represent with the gesture of the legs, but it's nothing really without the spine. Let's say you have legs apart, all that power, but then you have a depressed shoulder. It's still depressed. It's really not showing me a lot. It's just it's a depressed person who's trying not to fall down. Right? They're still extremely depressed. They're leaning on a wall. They're depressed. Their legs are apart. Maybe it's because they're a guy. And in order to be comfortable, they have to, damn, that guy's blessed. They have to spread their legs a little bit. It doesn't really do much to focus too much on the legs as the expression. It's all in the spine. Spine equals expression. And if you put the legs together, he just looks like a really depressed girl. Okay? Standing gestures, this is what I would call a standing gesture. These are great for character design if you're trying to do minimal stuff. But if she was supposed to be a powerful character, putting her legs together really made her more effeminate than powerful. I would, for a character that's female, was supposed to show a little bit of power, I would put the legs apart a little bit. Just like here. And then take this pose and put that there. And then, in fact, I would just switch out the legs to just see how much more complete each component is going to be once we do that. Okay, so you got a feminine pose there. And then you've got powerful pose there. Don't mix too much, because that's when the stuff you do will look a little silly. Because then you just can't really represent it properly. Remember, legs don't show a lot of expression. They're not the powerhouse of expression. Write that back. Legs can only do so much. And spine equals expression. Any other questions? Do you work spine out when rendering as well? No. This is just all gesture talk. No. When you're rendering, what you want to do is avoid, just make sure you're replacing your lines and avoid using small brushes at the edge of the canvas. When you're rendering, you should have already decided what your edge of the canvas is, what your focal points and composition is going to be, how you're going to stage the entire event, and then, and then you decide where your focal point is. That's where you start rendering. Right? But this is not rendering. This is gesture drawing. This is just perfecting how you draw humans in motion. There's a lot of biology involved, a lot of anatomy, and a lot of physics here and there with the rotation, or perspective stuff. Form. I feel like I wrote down the wrong landmarks points. So the landmarks are, I would say the cranium is a landmark, but I don't want to, if I say that, then you guys will draw it first. The cranium is the last landmark, so please don't draw the cranium first, for the love of God. Landmarks are spine, shoulders, hips, knees, and ankles, and then elbows and wrist. Okay, these are all active areas. These are all areas connected to joints. These are all fixed but have a lot of movement potential because they're connected to joints. These are all susceptible to rotation. These all decide where the parts of the body look, what the parts of the body are moving toward. And these are all secondary because they just attach to everything. And they are very squishy. They're not so fixed. All right, and they're all just really bubbly. You can see all these areas. I'm sorry, I'm using my mouse. These are all really fatty areas. We don't have a lot of bone in these areas, and because they're fatty, a sphere from any perspective looks like a boring old sphere. Doesn't really do much. Trust your reference. If you're drawing anyone with a prop, find someone with that same prop and trust the reference. Feet together in the middle, drawing is typically a paper doll archetype. The landmarks go hand in hand with proportions. Proportion and making sure that everything is the right size all has to do with zooming out. Zoom out if you want good proportions. If you're zooming in and you're using these long, encompassing gesture lines and you're this zoomed in, you can say goodbye to proportion. You're just too zoomed in to tell what it is you're doing to the scale and the distribution of mass. You're way too zoomed in. It's hard to tell when things are too big or too small. This artist here controlled their proportions very well, but then you look at this one, the head is massive. It's just way too big. Okay. I don't recommend you try another one of these. I recommend that you fix what you're doing here with the face. It's really well rendered, but you have the eyes looking in different areas, little spaced out. There's not much expression. She's sitting there saying, "Come here and impregnate me," but then she's also really zoned out like a doll, which is combining those two themes together is not a good mix. So you really have to show some expression. So maybe she has more of like a bedroom eyes. Maybe she's looking at her desired mate. I don't know. You're not just doing much with her face, and that combined with the head is just bad acting. Here I see an issue with the spine. I see that the spine is not really that important. And this kind of gesture, the spine is doing a lot, but it doesn't show that it's doing a lot, so it's really easy to forget about it. But it's doing a lot for the drawing. One little line, do you see that? One line, and we've connected the shoulders, the neck, and everything all together. And you're using way too many lines. Oh God, I almost did it. You're using way too many napkins. If you count your lines, you'll have more of a pressure to make sure you're using it in the right degree on the right object. If you're giving yourself an unlimited amount of lines to use, you get a drawing like this. Really great volume, but the delivery is so messy. And yes, the delivery matters. Yes, even if you're going to render on top of it. What are you going to do with these lines when it's time to render? You're going to have to redraw them anyways. You're going to have to decide which of these lines really is representing the edge of the arm. Right over here. So might as well just decide on one consistent line for the forearm so that you can identify where the edge is and where the volume ends. And that way you have an idea of what the wrist is going to be doing. If you're having all these inconsistent, like over here, what's happening with this anatomy? Can we or can we not see the hip bone jut out? Just decide on what's going to be happening with the body with one simple line. Stay zoomed out so you don't have that anxiety. When you zoom out, you have a better vantage point over masses and volume. Over here, because the body isn't, the leg is moving behind, the crotch is now in front. And do you see how much volume we just added with the C shape? Right, so zoom out for proportions. The head here is very small. When we zoom out, we can see that. Oh, that's too big now. Way too small before. After. Coming in pregnant. And then we have feet. I think you have some shoes on. We have the same issue with the shoulders here. And then we have these hairy lines here that are just not doing much. Any connecting, any in-between lines in between landmarks, you'll notice that you give a line especially for landmarks. You usually don't connect landmarks with secondary areas. So for me, I draw the shoulder. I find where the elbow is, and then I'll draw in the filler line between the elbow and the shoulder. So let's say this is the elbow. I'll connect that with that. Forget this. And then I would connect the other arm. Oopsie. Just like that. These would be my rough lines. Really calculated lines, not much hairy. I mean, these are still bad lines because I'm demonstrating. I'm not really counting. All right, and this is an extra line. And if you do have extra tails here and there, you can still erase those instead of just doing lines like these and ending where you're supposed to. This is a worse line than doing this and then erasing away at the extra shit you have. You still end up with a much straighter line, more confident and more professional. It's very unprofessional to have hairy back and forth chicken scratch lines. It's not a calculated mess. It's more of a, I don't know how to draw and I don't know how to hide it. All right, you can hide it with a little bit of this as you understand anatomy with cleaner lines. You have questions for the last sketch. I don't know what you mean is the last one. Which one? Working with reference, I suggest you draw over the reference and then go back to your drawing. That way you, even with hands, even with anything, that way you're preparing yourself for the multiple layers of gesture and motion and trend lines that you're going to be drawing. Okay, it's a very packed class today with lots of little tidbits of information, but trust me, they add up and make a drawing look much better. Even with your rough lines, I understand I allow you guys to have a little bit more freedom and looseness while you are working with your rough layer, but it should still be calculated even when you're working with your rough layer. So these are the 3 layers for gesture drawing and figure moving into figure drawing. The first layer are your gesture lines, your line of motion, the spinal gesture, as well as the standing, just that straight line of weight distribution for standing characters, if they're standing. The second layer is shapes. Add in your shapes. Add spheres where there are bodies of fat and muscle like the butt or the thighs or the calves, and add squares and cubes where you are anticipating the presence of cubes or any kind of corner. And then the final layer is when you lower the opacity of all those lower layers. So the first and second layer, gestures and shapes, you lower the opacity down. The final layer is the clean, long, thick lines. Doesn't have to be thick, but I recommend a certain amount of thickness if you're just putting gesture sketches on your portfolio. Don't use a tiny little brush. It's not going to help you. Those lines are going to be the calculated ones. And that's exactly how I do all of my figures that you've seen in my, anywhere. That's exactly what I've done. And I even try to keep the figures these are really, really old sketches and they're kind of shitty. But I try to keep as much of, as connected as possible to my original grounding lines. I don't even want to show them. They're so shitty. I'll just show one of them. This one. This was I think a year and a half ago I drew this one. The same deal. The spine decides the shape. Sneaky sneaker. The placement of the foot. All of this was decided. All this perspective was decided way before I started throwing in the clean lines, where everything started to slow down because I was really concerned with clean lines. None of these lines are really repeated. You find that one line goes for a while before it slows down. It slowed a little bit around here. So that I had an issue with that, I remember. This is exactly how I do it. It's not, you're not going to come to a point where you stop using planning lines. You're always going to need planning lines. Gesture lines, shapes, spheres and cubes, and clean long lines. Yep. Any questions before we get going? Excellent work, everyone. As for foreshortening, you can foreshorten a lot. So this arm right here, this hand is a bit too it's a bit too small. You can foreshorten a lot if the camera is right beside, and that's the key. That's all I can say about foreshortening for now. As long as you're using a reference and exaggerating scale, that's all foreshortening is. But remember, foreshortening only happens when the camera is close to the character. Write that down. Right? If the camera is equal distance all around, then this arm really doesn't need to shrink unless she's really kind of just thrown it into the distance. And it can get a little bit smaller than this one for sure, but not that much smaller. It wouldn't be that small. The character's still pretty close to the same distance away from the canvas. And unless she stretched her arm all the way away with stretchy arms like Luffy, then she wouldn't really shrink her arm that small. Her hand anyway, sorry. I have been rewarding good note takers with brush sets, so if you guys want some brush sets, even the entire brush set if the notes are great, and they have little diagrams and pictures and screenshots from the video, and they're all looking good, I give out rewards for that. Yeah, just get those notes up into the class notes category if you want some rewards. I like long notes done on being so focused. The fisheye effect. Yeah. Foreshortening only happens when the character is close to the camera. There is some slight foreshortening, like I said, when you have one limb really far away, but I wouldn't call it foreshortening. I would just call it perspective and a slight depth change. I would call it more depth rules. Whereas, slight depth, but whereas foreshortening and close to the camera is extreme depth. meaning that the hand, which is typically much smaller than the head, becomes bigger than the head, and the head is all the way away. Like in extreme worm's eye or bird's eye view, we would have a lot of foreshortening because there's a lot of stacking. Also, don't forget about stacking and foreshortening. One object in front of the other. The foreground of foreshortening, the bigger object, is going to be in front of the smaller background objects, even if it's the same shape. But as for characters that are all equally away from the camera, and one guy's just got one leg slightly further than the other, that's not foreshortening. Don't feel the need to shrink the entire size of the hand or leg or whatnot. It's just a slight little depth change. Scale is definitely used as we use it on mountains and trees, but we don't, not to the extent where it becomes a tenth of the size or 10 times the size. Okay, well that's it. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope this was informative. I'd love to see some sketches posted on the community that still have the gesture lines on them. So if you can do that, that would be an amazing response to today's lesson. So to go to the community, just go to istebrak.com and click on the community tab. Click here, and on the studies category, upload your notes to class notes. And in the studies category, re-upload some sketches for the person who did this. Show your working lines, show your work. Because if it's all just polishing that got you here, then it's not real fundamental knowledge, and it's still too dependent on references. Show where the landmarks are, show where the head rotation is, the crosshair for the head and the face. Throw in some arrows, throw in some major gesture lines, the large arcing gesture line as well as the spine gesture line. And just work like that. I'd love to see the work. Stop hiding your lines. Stop hiding your rough lines. Stop hiding your working lines. They're really make the painting, the sketch even look good. It looks like cool animation frames when you leave the working lines underneath. And then finally, I think animators are the best draftsmen. Like, they're the best at drawing. Maybe not the best at painting, maybe not the best at lighting or realism or texture or color, but they are definitely the best drawers, which is to say that they are constantly, like, I would say that they are just constantly, they're masterful lines, they are constantly rotating, they're always positioning the character in different perspectives, they're always dealing with scale, they're always thinking about motion and framing, actual like frames of the motion. They're always thinking about the desired angle or the desired the open space and the desired endpoint of the motion of the character as they're animated, and the starting point and how to connect the two, and what happens to gestures when they open and close, where legs face, the interior and exterior space, the foreground and the background. They're the best at drawing, and I think they're constant masters at it. It's just amazing what animators can do. And when you're drawing like an animator, which is thinking about the before and after frame and showing your rough lines and animating your gesture line before you ever started animating the face or the hands, it's really going to boost the quality of your work, and then your rough work is going to look like a masterwork. So think like an animator, watch some animation videos, look at what they do, what they're drawing first. Between each paper that they jump in between while they're animating, they're actually just animating the gesture line first between 3 frames so that they know what the character is about to do, what they previously did. Sorry, my voice is gone. And yeah, I want you guys to sketch like that. The gesture is where it all happens. All the character is in the gesture. Thank you everyone for attending. I'll see you guys on Thursday the 13th. If you guys have any questions or recommendations for our next class get together, post it on the discussion board. Just go to discussions here on the side and post your request on this, and we will be able to just get back to you, okay? All right. Bye, guys.